from here, we'll move on to our final presentation on this panel. Mokena from South Africa will tell us more about his professional practice as an architect. Thank you.
Thank you very much and good morning. I have a large number of slides, but I'll endeavor to go through them fairly rapidly. I want to first start by saying that I find a lot of resonance with the previous presenters for two core reasons. The one is this issue about rights of the city, which will be embedded in my presentation, but also the question of a sort of historical understanding about how cities evolve, how they develop, and particularly the role of public health as a sort of driver for beginning to reimagine the city. And this will come out in the presentation. I started by tackling this project by saying, how do we begin to describe rights to the city? And I think if we think of South Africa, particularly Cape Town, prior to 1994, I think the narratives were fairly simplistic. We had an apartheid regime which was in power. There was global agreement that it was evil, it needed to be removed. And the struggles that were being discussed essentially about identity, the struggle for public space, which happens both at a local interpretation, a regional interpretation, national, and even international interpretation. So, in other words, the role of architecture and identity prior to 1994, it was fairly easy to decide on which side of the fence did you locate yourself. And in some ways that made the discourse around the evolution of the city fairly simplistic and somewhat easy to begin to mobilize. But what we find post-1994 is a very different set of conditions beginning to emerge. The one is that identity begins to shift. We now have increasing service protests where words such as xenophobia come into play, different class groups beginning to emerge. And all of a sudden, we're beginning to find that conditions of local discourse have a sort of a national implication, an international role, but in this milieu of a mixing of interests and different priorities, it's become increasingly difficult to define what is the appropriate way to act and to intervene. What is the appropriate sort of architectural aesthetic or modus operandi which can begin to articulate a new way of being for this democracy. And I think that for me is quite an important point because there's often the illusion that revolution produces conditions of clarity. Very often you find it actually produces conditions of greater complexity and in some respects challenges with regards to how the planning is constructed and operated. The city I come from is fairly small. It's roughly 3.5 million people. But what makes it particularly interesting, I would argue, was that in 1913 we had a Housing and sort of Land Act which began to articulate and spatialize the geography of race and in particular economic classes in a very particular way. It was a grand experiment which was replicated throughout South Africa. And what this diagram begins to illustrate over here is that this dark section over here, which is Khayelitsha, which is a township which has the highest sort of population density, is located very far from the city, the central city, Cape Town, which is where the greatest assets are actually located. So we have this sort of urban conundrum where the people are located far from resources and goods, and the wealthy have low densities but the greatest access to services, police, infrastructure, etc. And I think this places a particular question on how does one begin to intervene. This photo over here is taken from the 1980s, where again the rights-based discourse was very much on the legislative context. Release, freedom of speech, due process. We have a very seminal moment in our history, 1976, where the youth began to suddenly take a very particular role in terms of their needs and how the city and the state needs to evolve. But now we have an image which, aside from the sort of fact that it's in color, the composition is fairly similar, but the issues are very different. Join the fight against xenophobia, which is a positive thing, but there were also protests in favor of xenophobia. Don't touch my sister, which in some respects is an issue about gender rights, but there's also been a sort of traditional backlash to say that, Africans have the right to have multiple wives and treat the women in particular ways. So the narratives have become increasingly complex and making it quite difficult. And most recently, we've had a terrible disaster in terms of the Marikana, which is a mine disaster. And there it was a peaceful protest by miners protesting to the very government, one would argue, would be receptive to their attention, but the police opened fire upon them. And I think this is quite an interesting thing to recognize, that struggle is continuous. The narratives are, I think, what is probably more important there. But for South Africa, 1994 hasn't meant peace. If anything, it has created greater conditions of complexity and fracture. This is an image of Cape Town with the stadium that was used for the World Cup. I deliberately show this to demonstrate that it is known as a beautiful city, a place where there's capital. a place where the rich and famous come. Mark Thatcher had his house there. A place where the elites are able to subsist and survive and not be conscious of the poor majority who are often located literally within 15 minutes driving distance. And the irony here, similar as one of my previous speakers has spoken, is that we have a condition where the impoverished people are still voting for the very same powers that put them in these sort of circumstances, but at the same time have extremely violent protests. So there's this contrast between violent protest but absolute passivity at the ballot box. And these type of conditions, I just showed this image. This is another township condition, but just to say that this is very familiar to yourselves, I'm sure. So the question is, what is the role of architecture and design in the context of shifting identity, in the context of changing narratives, in the context of trying to represent this new democracy, and what does that mean for institutional spaces and architecture in particular? And I will start through a number of scales and start with something fairly mundane and ordinary. But I was contacted to do a trophy for the World Cup by Budweiser. And that was quite an interesting challenge, because the first thing I said is, well, let us look at the construction of trophies as we understand it. And the laurel wreath from Greece, and et cetera, et cetera. And they're essentially driven by this sort of notion of the chalice, which has a very particular Western sort of ideology behind it. So I made this a sort of ideological question: what would be an African form of recognizing success? And what I began to look at was beadwork, gourds made from horns and structures, and begin to say, how do we make this African and how do we make this different? In other words, how does Africa make a significant contribution in terms of the aesthetic of something as ordinary as a trophy? Budweiser being the client, I decided to recycle their glasses to create glass beads, recycle the caps to create a sort of metal mesh, inspired by local forms and dance to produce a trophy form such as this. What I find interesting about this is that I was told that I had won this competition and it was going to be rolled out for the World Cup. But I think the marketing director of Budweiser in the United States says this doesn't look African, so they made me win second and I didn't get to do this. But I think it's quite interesting that an official in Budweiser in the United States can tell me what is African. So the struggle of identity is something which I think is quite particular. Now let's talk about the police. The case was just mentioned now about Tunisia, where police brutality on a vendor, and we have the same problem in South Africa. I was given a commission to actually create a new type of police station, and for me, the challenge. It seems a fairly simplistic exercise, but before I'd intervened, police stations had very narrow windows so you could shoot people. They had big fences. They were fortresses where you couldn't tell what was happening. It was the type of place where if you were raped and you went there, you felt as if you had done something wrong. So the question of the identity of the architecture and its location there became my particular challenge. So I was told I must use brickwork because it's low maintenance and you need a fence, you need this, and I totally turned the proposition on its head by creating a building which doesn't have a fence. It has no burglar bars on the windows. It effectively looks almost like an art gallery. And there was quite a strong existential challenge with regards to the client, because they actually said, this is too good for our staff. We're going to ruin this building. And I told them that if you create buildings where you think that your staff are the animals, then that is no wonder why they beat people in the streets. So this was fairly successful in that it actually changed the whole national aesthetic of police stations. Not that they're copying this form, but that language has been taken throughout the whole country. It's won a number of awards. And I'm proud of the fact that it has no graffiti, and it's not just because it's difficult to graffiti a police station, but the police themselves haven't ruined the building. And the staff are exceedingly proud to be there. So there is this relationship where one can take this narrative of a police service and say, what's the architectural implication as opposed to a police force? And what is the implication of that sort of architectural aesthetic? Greenpoint Stadium, another sort of challenge that I was encountered with, which was to design a stadium for the World Cup. And again, there was the whole trope of how does one create a stadium for the World Cup and how can it actually be of its place and be African. So I was inspired by a number of things. The notion of, again, the beadwork and the gourd, the tree where people educate themselves, our national flower being the protea, and the landscape. And essentially what I decided to do was to create a building which has an outdoor market on the outside and the stadium on the inside. And this is particularly because the site that was selected was an informal market that had been in operation for about 100 years. And as tends to happen with these type of mega-scale projects, they get displaced in the interests of these sort of multinational approaches. So my design was trying to mediate and say you can still have this world-class so-called event, but actually create a market space on the outside which actually gives dignity to the trade that has been happening there. Sadly, we didn't win the competition. I was told that the design was too radical, but what's more important, I think, is that the stadium that is there has absolutely no informal trading at the base. It plays no particular role, and it's been a bone of contention in terms of it being a white elephant. The reason being that design had no relationship to the existing informal economy or even any interest. And I think that's an interesting thing in terms of the aesthetics of new public buildings. I was then tasked to do a community center in Khayelitsha, which is the largest township in Cape Town, the youngest township in the country. It was formed in the 1980s. It means new place. Interesting name, but it was a place where people were removed to. Thank you. And intervening in a township is a very interesting challenge. I think for me, the lesson that I want to offer here is that this was a building which was the first building which was meant to have a permanent or sense of permanence in the landscape. Khayelitsha is a place where there are fires which happen annually. Everybody stays in shacks, so there's that sense of fragility, that sense of temporality was very, very predominant in the minds of the people there. And I decided to create a community structure which gave them a sense that the government is here to stay and will not abandon you and it will not burn down. Similarly, this building does not have a fence around it. It's totally accessible, no burglar bars. I was told they would vandalize it. They haven't. But what you'll find interesting is in South Africa, there's money to do the building and no money to do the road. So it's one of those odd problems about the lack of synergy between government. Public transport offices. Taxi violence has racked South Africa for a particularly long time, and it's a result of the fact that the taxi industry effectively emerged in the 70s and the 80s because the state was not investing in public transport, so people decided to create their own structures. And I was tasked to create a building in which the taxi officials would be brought in to have their tribunes, to have their meetings, to have their discussions, and it was the first building which actually tried to give dignity to the taxi industry as a whole. Because what happened before is that when you got your license as a taxi driver, there was no formality to it. And I argue that if you want to formalize this industry, if you want to give dignity, if you want to celebrate the service, give them a building which shows you that the government is paying attention to their needs. And that was quite an interesting project from that side. I'm going to quickly go through because I need to skip very, very quickly. Just to talk about another project. This is more of an urban one. It's about a freedom fan mile or fan walk within South Africa. And what the impetus there was to try and create a condition where we could look at connecting public spaces through public art, running competitions, and actually engaging people to take charge of their artistic representation of space. The diagram that we then produced took on this form, connecting the stadium to the station, but essentially looking at the street space as a space for cultural and artistic expression, and also tying in with regards to the World Cup infrastructure, but most importantly also creating another sort of fan mile within the township. And the client in this instance was the Food and Allied Workers Union, who actually asked me to locate a museum and a public park and a sort of fan mile for themselves. And these two sorts of systems coexist. And it's something quite important in Cape Town that very often we find we have to intervene in the sort of established parts of the city and the less established to provide equivalent forms of investment. This is a housing project that I did. I'm going to move very, very rapidly and just essentially jump to this diagram. The key here is twofold. One is that in this project I created 8 different type of typologies or spaces, which would allow for the first time different income groups to reside within the same building within South Africa, because historically the housing policy addressed only the poor, addressed only the middle class, or only the banking sector. And this is the first time that there was one building where this was all accommodated, and there was an urban park which actually allowed the production of food and markets to begin to take place, and there's actually a synergy. So I managed to convince the housing department to invest in a park and invest in the market so that you can create employment and food security for the precinct as a whole. I'm going to move through fairly quickly. There was lots of discussion about the aesthetics of this architecture, but I shall move on. And also this sort of image, which I think kind of exemplifies the sort of incongruency between different income groups, culture, and so on, that it is possible to have delightful spaces where different people interact and intermingle. My last project, really, and I'll just take 2 minutes over here, I was tasked to look at Cape Town Station. And the challenge here is that Cape Town Station was an institutional building that was launched in the 1960s as a shining example to apartheid. People would protest and run to the station. People were beaten there. People were tortured in this building. And it was a very difficult challenge in terms of how does one deal with this scar in the landscape and create, or rather reinvent this infrastructure with a large lawn in the front where nobody was allowed to touch. You were beaten if you walked on the grass. There were only 2 entrances into the building. And essentially it was a sort of imposition on the landscape. We proposed a radical reimagination of the station square. We said this needs to be part of the city, whether it be events, whether it be performance. It would essentially widen the sort of democratic space or footprint of the city. This is the current articulation of that space. It's a work in progress. But I think what's significant is to show how the space has been used now as opposed to before where nobody could interact on it. And now it has been used for a number of celebrations, parties, and so on. So it is possible to take some of these sort of in-between conditions and spaces, and if you have a sort of ideological output to say that this space can play a public function, it can be transformed in that sort of fashion, and it can play a much bigger sort of role in terms of mega-scale events, protests, etc. And in the interest of time, I just wanted to show you these slides of the inside of the space, which is a sort of radical transformation of the building, which had an engagement with the city in the inside and the outside. And my last project, actually, I think I have 2 more projects, but I'm going to finish this now. I'm involved with a very interesting project. The Grand Parade is a public space in Cape Town where there's been a number of protests historically. It's a place where Nelson Mandela first addressed the nation when he was released in 1990. And the urban project that I've been involved in has been to reimagine this public square, also located with the oldest colonial building on the subcontinent, and actually make it part of a sort of larger urban diagram connecting public spaces, public experiences, and creating a new form of democratic aesthetic as well as a more functional sort of space. And what has been interesting there has been reimagining the old bus shelter on that site, not just as a bus shelter, but as the opportunity to produce food, to offer recycling amenities, but to also see that space as a modern type of market. Currently, this place is only used for parking, and again, it's very, very constrained. And we made the argument that this public space can play not only an economic function where markets can begin to operate, but the transport infrastructure can play a productive role as well as a job creation role in the society. And of course, lots of debates about what is an appropriate aesthetic for South Africa and so on. But I think more importantly, it's about saying how can the architecture and the urbanism create new modes of being, new modes of production, or at least acknowledge existing sorts of energies. And this last project that I've been involved in was to create a museum for design, innovation, leadership, and art. And this might not seem contentious to this particular audience, but I was actually inspired by a star constellation. It's an ancient African star constellation known as the Pleiades with the Greeks. And I use this as a reference point in terms of the architecture, but the amount of debate that this stirred in Cape Town, because when one makes architecture, one must have Western references. You cannot refer yourself to African mythology. It's totally inappropriate. It's savage. Was quite telling for me. I worked using Ron Eglash. He's done sort of mathematical studies of hair braiding and settlements to show that there are mathematical logics behind this, and essentially created a building which was inspired by this sort of language and metaphor. And I think it was a disjuncture for them, because the argument was that if it's going to be an African building inspired by African tradition, it should look like a hut, or it should be somewhat informal. So for me, that was quite an interesting thing to demonstrate that one can be inspired and informed by even pre-colonial sort of ideas to produce a contemporary expression which is responsive to today's sorts of needs. And I think that's quite an interesting thing, because the whole sort of insecurity about Africa's place in the discourse of design, whether we are a place where people experiment upon, or whether we have the right to actually contribute to the global discourse of design, is something that I think needs to be elaborated and discussed further. And these are just simple shots of that. Some of the interior spaces that I had conceived, the building on the outside. And just to quickly skip over this project, I was tasked to do a 2030 vision for the city of Cape Town, with all of the sort of challenges about what does that mean in terms of access to public space, density, what is the appropriate type of language. But what was interesting here, at the very end of the project, after working for almost 2 years where we had demonstrated that we could substantially transform the density of the city, we could increase public transport, we could increase access, we could make a much safer and much more amenable city. What came out and what actually killed the project wasn't the design itself. The question was said informally, but which people are going to move here? So the project became a threat because it was going to distort the sort of voting dynamic, political demographic, a CBD which is largely gentrified and largely white, for lack of a better phrase, and our project which proposed that we could double the size of the city, make it more efficient, and bring in economic groups who currently don't have access to the rights to the CBD. The project was seen as too controversial for that very reason. And I think it's quite interesting to understand from my perspective that sometimes design is not enough. Sometimes it has to do with the politics at play behind it. Sometimes how identity represents itself can transform a place but actually be problematic. But I just wanted to show you projects ranging literally from a trophy to reimagining a city, that there's a very strong interrelationship between the aesthetic of a place, public life, architecture, and as much as these interventions cannot transform society, I think certainly the way we imagine public spaces and buildings can be a mirror to how we see ourselves and how we make decisions about urban development in general. And that's my presentation in brief.
Thank you very much, Mokena. Very inspiring presentation. We desperately need this kind of reference point as well. I think in the Cairo context, where ideas about contemporary architecture are still very much stuck within, I think, a class framework where poor people don't really deserve good design, or that decent design costs more, so therefore we're not going to do it, we're not going to bother. You've proven, I think, from another context, a very relevant context, that actually all these presumptions are not true, or not necessarily true.